Hi, Ann. So this assignment that we're going to take a look at the images for was all about controlling the depth of field in a photograph. And just a reminder, the depth of field refers to the area that is in sharp focus in a photograph. And sometimes depth of field gets confused with motion blur, but they are two really different things. Motion blur is related primarily to the shutter versus depth of field, which is related to the lens and the aperture. So let's look at a couple of your images here and talk about them real quick. So your large depth of field image, you've got an f-stop of 25, which is likely the maximum or the highest f-stop value that goes up to, which is fantastic. That is one of the factors that is going to give us a large depth of field. As a reminder to the instruction in the module, there are actually three things that you need to do to get or to control depth of field. So the first thing is that aperture value, which in this case you totally nailed. F25, that's exactly where you should be for the large depth of field. The second thing is you need to be far away from the subject. And out of the three things, being far away probably is maybe perhaps the least impactful on the depth of field, but nonetheless, it still does have an impact on it. So I wouldn't say you're like very far away from the subject, but you are kind of far away. And then last but not least, you want to use a wide angle lens. And again, if you remember from the module, wide angle lenses are lenses that are typically 40 millimeters and below. So you're at 28 millimeters here. So if we look at this image, and 28 millimeters again is gonna just by the design of the lens give us a large depth of field. So if we look at this image, you're pretty much in sharp focus all the way through to about this zone right here. And right about here, your focus starts to fall off in the background. And the reason the focus starts to fall off is you're kind of close to this. So that one factor of the three, which the factor is how far you are away from the subject. In this case, you're relatively close to the subject. So that's why you're starting to get a little bit of softness in the background here out of the three. So you got two out of the three here, and out of the three, the one that you didn't do so well is, and that's probably not the best way to phrase it, the one that is probably the least ideal selection or way to approach it is the one that's causing the background to go out of focus here, and then that one is just the distance you are away from something, which it looks like you might be 3, 4, 5 feet away from this this ball here. So now let's compare that to your second image. You can see in the second image the background, let's zoom in here a little bit, the background is definitely more out of focus. So you definitely have a smaller depth of field going on there. And if we look at your settings, so again here you've got an aperture that is exactly where I would want it to be. You are very close to the ball, which again, for a small depth of field, that is exactly what I would want it to be. But our problem here lies in the focal length. In this case, you're at a wide angle lens. Ideally, we'd like to be at a telephoto lens rather than a wide angle lens. So in this instance, we want that focal length above 50 millimeters, and that would give us a little bit more exaggerated depth of field. So do you have a small depth of field here? Kind of, your background's out of focus. But let me show you an image where we've got a really ideal depth of field here. So just give me a second. I'm going to pause this and call one up. Okay, so here's an image that I took over at the Buffalo Club And we can see the flowers are in really sharp focus. Background is in soft focus. And when we look at our numbers here, we can go in and see. So the f-stop was an f-stop of 22. Not 22, 2.2, which is very low. It's just slightly lower than I tried to find one that was pretty close to what you were shooting with there. ISO of 400, you were at 800, but again, kind of similar. But here we have a 50 millimeter lens rather than a 28 millimeter lens. And just that slight lens difference, you know, from a wide angle to a normal focal length, what we call normal or very short telephoto lens here, that gives us a background that is really completely out of focus here. So rather than shooting with the wide angle lens, shooting with that 50 millimeter lens is giving us a very shallow depth of field here. Sorry, let me give you another example. So here's your classic sports image. And when you look at sports images, and especially maybe now that we've talked a little bit about this depth of field concept, you'll notice this a lot. But notice how the banner in the background is completely out of focus, and our subject in the foreground here is in sharp focus. We look at our settings. So here we've got an f-stop of 5.6, which is again kind of right around where you were. You were at 4. 5.6 is again somewhat close to that. But the key here that's given me the depth of field is the focal length of the lens. This is a long telephoto lens, 400 millimeters, and just by the very nature of the lens, the optical makeup of it, it's going to give us a shallow depth of field. So if you kind of think about it, it's almost the inverse of the wide angle lens. So the wide angle lens is almost always going to give you a large depth of field, whereas the telephoto lenses are almost always going to give you a shallow depth of field. Now, certainly again, the f-stop is going to play a role, and how close you are to the subject is also going to play a role. But you know, there's three things that are in play here that you always have to factor in, on top of factoring in also your shutter settings and your ISO settings on the image. So hopefully that helps you. Again, you know, sort of all of these things, they're not like math equations where 2 + 2 always equals 4. You're going to be dealing with different situations all the time. You're going to have different lighting situations. You're going to have different movement speeds of your subject. You are going to have own individual factors such as, you know, how softly you squeeze the trigger. Do you drink a lot of coffee and maybe have a little bit of a shake? All of those things are factors that you've got to you know, take into consideration when you're making choices about what to shoot things at and what not to shoot them at. So a lot of this, unfortunately, is you going out and practicing. And then I asked you to kind of sort of self-evaluate things. But that's kind of the key. You know, you've got to go out and shoot images and then look at these images, open them up in Photoshop and say, okay, the depth of field here looks kind of good, but why doesn't it look great? And then figure out for yourself, okay, well, is it how close I am? Is it the lens selection? Is it the aperture value? Which one of those factors, or all three of those factors, is it that is causing me to not have the ideal amount of depth of field in an image? So hopefully that helps you a little bit, as I said, and always happy to chat with you. Feel free to give me a buzz, and honestly, I almost feel better talking about these things with you in person than I do creating these videos. They are in many ways impersonal, and you know, don't oftentimes address maybe some specific questions that you have about things uh, that probably arose during the time that you were taking the photo. So for now, that's it. But give me a buzz if you have any questions. I can always be reached at the mobile number that's at the bottom of my emails. So let me know how it goes with this. Thanks.